5 tiny sewing tips that have huge impact. These tips are very easy to apply, but you will be surprised how much they affect the sewing quality. Let's start with number 1 and how to work with fraying fabrics. So the trouble of working with fraying fabrics begin right away when you want to wash it in the washing machine and those raw edges tangle. So the easy solution to avoid this problem is prior to putting it into the washing machine, you want to serge both raw edges or zigzag both raw edges. This way, when the fabric is being washed in the washing machine, those fraying edges won't be tangling. Continuing with the same tip and working with fraying fabrics, once you cut out your pattern detail from that very fraying fabric, go ahead and serge all around that pattern detail. This will protect the raw edges of the fabric from fraying during the sewing process, and the sewing process will become just so much easier and much more smooth. One thing I want to add is just because you finish the raw seam allowance with a zigzag or serger, it doesn't mean that you have to keep the seam finish in the finished garment. You can continue making the seam finishes you want. You can do the bias binding, you can do the French seam, you can do the roll hem, you can do everything. And the zigzag and the serger seam is there only to protect the edges from fraying during the sewing process. Remember this tip next time when you're working with really fraying fabrics like linen or boucle, and you will see how much of a difference this tiny change makes. Second tip is when you're working with garments that have a lining, add a little piece of string or strap between the main shell and the lining. So let's say if you're working on a coat or a jacket, you want to install a piece of about 1 or 1.5 centimeter length strap or string in the armholes, attaching the bottom of the main shelf of the armhole and the lining armhole. If you're working with a dress, you can do the same at the darts or the sides. So what this step will give us, it will prevent the lining from rotating in the garment, and it will make it putting the garment on and wearing it so much easier. And because the string is about 1 or 1.5 centimeter length, it gives us a little bit of ease, and it doesn't feel like the lining is directly attached to the shell, which would not be very comfortable. Moving on to tip number 3 is when you're cutting very slippery fabrics. So when you cut slippery fabrics, this can really be a headache, but what helps control that slipperiness is using tissue paper for cutting. So you take one piece of tissue paper, you put your fabric on top of that piece of paper, and on top of the fabric you put a second piece of tissue paper, preferably with your pattern lines drawn onto. Then you pin at seam allowance all 3 layers together. And you want to use quite a lot of pins to really secure that fabric inside of the tissue paper. Then you go ahead and simply cut through all 3 layers at once. This method really helps manage that slipperiness of the fabric, and it makes cutting the fabric so much easier. Fourth tip is don't always do back stitches. So while it is often recommended to begin and end a seam with the back stitches, sometimes this particular way of ending and beginning the seam does not work best. When you're working with very lightweight sheer fabrics, if you begin and end the seam with back stitches, you may notice that the beginning or the end of the seam kind of crumbles and it sort of shrinks the fabric at that spot, and it just doesn't look nice. Alternatively, when you're doing top stitching, you don't want to make back stitches because it will create a very visible beginning and end of the seam. This will be especially noticeable if you're working with thicker thread. So what to do instead? In the beginning and the end of the seam, you want to leave long thread tails. So a seam without back stitches and end the seam again with long thread tails and no back stitches. Then using hand needle, bring both long thread tails from the top of the garment to the inside of the garment, tie the knots with all 4 threads together and cut it. This way, when you're doing top stitching, you will get a smooth and seamless seam finish. And by looking at it, you won't be able to tell apart where the seam begins and ends. And when you do this when sewing very lightweight fabrics, you will get a very nice and smooth beginning of the seam and end of the seam. I know that this is a very small tip, but trust me, it does make a very big difference. And fifth and final tip I wanted to share today is about thread storage. So I debated whether or not I should include this tip, because probably to a lot of you this is very obvious, but honestly for me it took me years to figure it out, so I wanted to share it. If you have a lot of threads, you know that those threads like to unwind and tangle and make a mess, which can be annoying. Lucky for us, a lot of manufacturers include some solution in the thread cone, how you can secure that loose thread end and keep it from unwinding. So the majority of sewing threads will have a groove at the bottom or the top of the thread spool. You just take the loose thread end, wrap it around that groove, and it will secure the end. The next time you want to use the thread, you will just simply unwind it by hand and use it. So this way is very obvious, but sometimes manufacturers like to hide their solutions, and you really need to investigate the cone that you have. So here is an example with a serger thread that I had for like a year until I figured out that the bottom of the spool pushes out, and then you get this groove where you wrap the thread end, then you push back the bottom, and the thread is locked in place. Honestly, it took me a year of having this particular thread to find out about this feature. Another good example is with the embroidery thread that I also had for a very long time. And from the first glance, it didn't have any sort of solution for that loose thread end until I noticed a very thin, very short cut at the bottom of the spool. So I just simply took the loose thread end, put it through that cut, and it was secured in place. So not all thread cones or spools will have these sort of solutions, but I do invite you to investigate what you have at home in your sewing thread collections, and maybe you will be surprised, like I was, that some of your spool threads have those hidden solutions already installed. This tip had a massive impact on how clean my thread storage looks. So here are all 5 tiny tips I wanted to share today, but I would love to hear what tiny sewing tips you have that make a very big difference. So please leave that in the comments. I would love to read it. Thank you for watching today, and I will see you next time. Bye!